morning, folks, and welcome to another edition of Morning Coffee and a Thought. I'd like to talk to you today in kind of a heart-to-heart fashion on the subjects of integrity and, related to that, being in the place where God wants you to be. I was recently struck the other day by a newspaper article which I read concerning a youth pastor in a church who was charged with sexual interference with minors. And the article struck me very forcefully. And that's why I want to discuss these two topics that I feel are related: integrity and being in the place where God wants you to be. Years ago, when I was a young man, I used to travel to a very large church in Detroit, Michigan. And I was there one night, I believe, for a Sunday evening service. And a minister from Findlay, Ohio was speaking. And the message that night was called, "You've Only Come to Shechem." And I was fascinated by the message, but I never realized what a role that message would end up playing in my life. And we'll talk about that later. First of all, let's talk about the message. The message concerned the life of Jacob. Jacob's life begins in Genesis chapter 25. He is a twin, comes out of the womb second, and kind of all his life strives to be number one. We read how he tricked his brother out of his inheritance, which was 2/3 of the estate, which was owned by their father Isaac, and then later took his brother's blessing away from him, also by trickery. And so after this occurred, he fled, his father and mother both believing that his brother Esau would take revenge for the actions of Jacob. So Jacob flees and heads to his mother's family back in the area of Padan Aram. And as he's going on this journey, in Genesis, he finds a place where he wants to sleep for the night. And as he's sleeping, he has a very vivid dream of a ladder with the angels of Yahweh ascending and descending up and down this ladder. And he wakes up in the morning and he is so convinced, this dream being so vivid, that he is by the house of God. And so he sets up a stone and he names the place Bethel, which means the house of God, or the portal leading to God. And he makes a vow that morning to God that on his journey, if God keeps him safe and gives him a successful journey, that he will return and Yahweh will become his God, and he will give Yahweh 1/10 of everything that he possesses. And so Jacob leaves his family for over 20 years and then decides to return after he gets into some conflicts with his father-in-law. But he leaves with a lot of possessions. And as he comes back home, he knows that he has to make peace with his brother Esau. And so we're told in Genesis that the two brothers finally meet and they reconcile and make peace with each other. And Jacob, after this, heads on his journey. But Jacob doesn't quite return to Bethel. He stops at the ancient Israelite city of Shechem and decides that he and his family are going to pitch their tents just outside the city. And this turns out to be a bad decision. When we don't get to the place where God wants us to be, bad things can happen. And so when he makes the decision that he's just going to stay in Shechem, a chain of events takes place. First of all, the son of the ruler of the city decides that he likes one of Jacob's daughters, and he rapes her, but then offers to marry her. Jacob's sons are appalled by what's been done to the sister, and so they trick the people of Shechem into getting circumcised. The people of Shechem fell for this because they wanted to intermarry with Jacob's family. They had a motive behind this. They thought that if they could intermarry, then eventually they could assimilate Jacob and his family into the society at Shechem and probably plunder his goods over time. But Jacob's sons have another idea. They're out for revenge. So while the people of Shechem are recovering from the circumcision, the sons go in and murder everybody in the town. Jacob realizes that he has made a huge mistake. And as he goes to sleep the following night, God speaks to him and says to him, "Return to Bethel." I thought about this story relative to my own life. Back in 1989, I took my first church. I knew in my heart I was called to preach, and the people around me felt that calling, so there was never a question in my mind as to my calling. But there was a question as to where I was morally. And when I say that, I mean that I hadn't totally dedicated, I believe at the time, everything God wanted me to dedicate to Him. In other words, I wasn't at the place God wanted me to be. But when I went out, I was very successful. We did a lot of good things in the church, set up a new constitution, set up new ministry, reached out to the community around us. And for 6 or 7 years, we had tremendous success. It was a wonderful ride. But eventually, because I wasn't in the place that I should have been with the Lord, bad things started to happen. I made some really bad judgment calls. And as a result of those bad judgment calls, I ended up losing my marriage and losing the church. I think of another example of David, who in 2 Samuel chapter 11 was not in the place where God wanted him to be. It says that in the spring, normally, kings led their armies out to war. David was a warrior king. That's what God had called him to do. But in this particular springtime, rather than going out with his troops, he decided to let Joab, his military commander, do the leading, and he would just stay at home. And that led to a bunch of bad decisions. It led to adultery and eventually led to the murder of the woman's husband. Commitment is what God asks for. It's wonderful to have endeavors and to do God's work, but it's not good when your heart is not in the place where it should be. When God calls you to go to Bethel, you can't stop at Shechem. When God calls you to go to battle, you can't take a rest in Jerusalem because bad things happen. God wants integrity from those who are doing endeavors for Him. And I want to leave that with you today. Number one, are you in the place God wants you to be? And if you're hearing me today and you feel maybe you're not there, I would highly recommend through personal experience that you go to the Lord and get that settled out. When I fell many years ago, it took me 25 years to return to the ministry. Not that God doesn't forgive you. God forgives. But it takes a long time, once integrity has been lost, to get back that trust again from those around you. And so I want to leave you with that thought today. Be in the place where God wants you to be. Don't camp at Shechem. Go all the way with the Lord. Go to Bethel. Go where God's at. And you'll find that your walk with God will be far more successful and you'll have far better outcomes. So I leave that thought with you today, and we'll talk to you next week.